Memory, that's an interesting phenomenon because we tend to think of memory as something like a videotape recording, and it's not that at all. Memory is very malleable, and every time you bring a memory to mind and discuss it and contemplate it, you actually change the shape of the memory, partly because you're contextualizing it differently as you think about it. And so it alters and transforms while you play with it. And that's sort of how the story of your life emerges from the memories of your life. And there's a back and forth between that constantly. And so and what were things like for you in Great Britain? Where did you move specifically?
Just to London, to southwest London, Wimbledon, where I was brought up. My auntie and uncle helped out, my great aunt and uncle helped out, and my mum and dad got jobs. They worked very hard, typical immigrant worker jobs, helping in a kitchen and helping on a building site. But things were very good. I mean, looking back, we were very poor. But at the time, we didn't really feel poor.
Yeah, well, if you have hope, you're not poor.
Exactly.
I lived in Montreal as a graduate student, and I lived in a poor neighborhood. And I didn't have much money because I was on a fellowship, and I at that particular time, I was supporting Tammy, at least to some degree. But I knew I had a future that was likely to progress upward. And I started to really understand the difference between not having money and being poor at that point, because all my neighbors were poor. The neighborhood I lived in was it wasn't a slum by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a neighborhood that had been multi-generationally poor. And it was poor enough so there were some people who'd fallen completely out of the system in the neighborhood, and they were, by all measures, poor, fractured, fragmented, broken. And I thought, well, what's the difference here exactly? I don't have any money and they don't have any money, but I'm definitely not poor and they're definitely poor. And I realized that almost the entire difference was, well, I had nothing but opportunity in front of me. And if you have nothing but opportunity in front of you, assuming you're not starving, you're not poor. And partly because we live to a far greater degree than we realize on faith and hope. And if there's a pathway open in front of you. So even with your parents, if they believed that you were likely to have a life that was going to improve quite dramatically as it progressed, then they have a reason for all their sacrifices and their work. And then with that reason, you're not exactly poor. You just don't have any money. That's not the same thing.
No, I agree. You have hope. And I was in an ambulance a while ago with someone who was critically ill. And I remember the ambulance driver, I was saying, do you think they'll make it? And they say, yeah, sure, they will. I'm sure they will. You have to have hope. And they said this nice phrase. They said, hope is the last thing to die. That's really, in a way, the way it should be. If it dies before it should, then you die shortly thereafter because you have to have hope.
Yeah, well, you see, with clinical depression, it has two components. And one is that people suffer from both an overwhelming influx of pain and anxiety. So that's on the negative emotion front. And you might think that that's sufficient to produce depression, but it's not. Real depression is also characterized by the eradication of positive emotion. And hope is really, if you had to specify a single word to represent the bulk of the positive emotion that people most truly want to experience, hope is likely the best word, because hope is experienced in relationship to a goal, to a valued goal. And so if you see yourself progressing towards a valued goal, or you see any pathway whatsoever open up towards a valued goal, then you have hope. And if you're truly depressed, that hope vanishes and all you see in front of you are obstacles and pitfalls. And then if you add pain and anxiety to that, you've got a good recipe for despair. And that despair, that's poverty. And this is an important thing to understand, because this is, I think, one of the problems of both the right and the left wing ideas in relationship to money. The left thinks that poverty is caused by lack of money. And you can't cure despair with money. You can add impulsive hedonism to despair with money, but you can't cure it with money. And the right, well, we'll leave that out of the conversation for now. And so what was your childhood like in Wimbledon?
Yeah, it's very It was very good, very happy. My mum and dad were probably more dependent on me than usual parents because they couldn't speak English as quickly as I could or as well as I could.
Right.
So I had to help them read letters and help them do things. But it was a very, they loved me so much. And that was the main thing they did for me. But it was a good upbringing. Obviously, everything was state paid, the school, because we didn't have money to go to a fee-paying school. But I had a very happy upbringing. At least it appears to be the case now. When I pull my memory out about it and put it back, I had lots of good friends. There was one thing, as we were talking earlier about where you lived in Montreal, which I thought was quite interesting, is that because we were so relatively poor, we had a house with 3 bedrooms in it, but because we didn't have so much money to pay for it, we rented out a lot of the rooms. This is like 50 years ago. And so you'd always have different, I think, people who live, I wouldn't say in poverty, but people who don't have much money, they often live closer together and on top of each other. And so we had lots of people coming in and out of the house. I remember there was an Iranian couple, an Irish builder, an old lady who lived in the house. And you saw quite a lot of life jammed up close. And that was quite good as a kid for me to see so many different people from different societies, really.
Right.
I didn't realize that at the time, but it was really good.
Right. Well, there must have been some advantage too, to being depended upon like that by your parents at such an early age, because that puts you children really like to have genuine responsibility. If you can lay out a pathway forward for them so that they are contributing in some way that isn't merely illusory, it helps them pay for the burden of their care. And it's not like they're thinking that through, but they're feeling it. Kids, because they're human, would just as soon be in a reciprocal relationship if they can manage it. And one of the advantages to being in the situation that you're in is that you actually did have some real things to do. It mattered that you could speak English and read and intermediate for your parents. And certainly that places a quasi-adult burden on you. And you could imagine that could get overwhelming if your parents were struggling and barely staying afloat. But you could also see that could be an optimal situation for someone young. How were you treated by the other kids in the neighborhood? You're an immigrant kid. I mean, the trope would be that would go badly. And of course, obviously, often it doesn't. I don't think it probably goes badly more often than a kid's life in general goes badly.
Yeah.
So, but how were you
treated? Very well. I mean, in where I was brought up in London, there were lots of immigrants really for different phases. There's different phases of immigration. I've always found England, or London anyway, the least sort of racist place going. But there were lots of Irish kids, Indian kids, Caribbean kids. So it was pretty mixed up, and there wasn't any racism. So everyone was kind of welcomed in the immigrant community, and the English people were also very welcoming. So I've never had any I've always felt welcome here, for which I'm really appreciative, and so are my mother and father.
Right.